The Mafia boss heard a waitress speak Italian to his mother, "You just stole my heart." The crystal chandeliers of the exclusive restaurant cast fractured light across the mahogany table. But Everett's cold, calculating eyes were fixed solely on the waitress. His elderly mother, usually lost in the foggy labyrinth of her fading mind, was gripping the young woman's apron. Then, the waitress leaned down. She didn't speak the crude, modernized Italian of the streets. She whispered in the melodic, nearly extinct dialect of his mother's coastal village, a secret language Everett hadn't heard since his childhood. His mother's eyes flooded with sudden, crystalline tears of pure joy. Everett's breath caught in his throat. He stood up, the legs of his chair scraping sharply against the marble floor. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice a low, dangerous tremor. "Because you just stole my heart." The dining room of Lawara was a sanctuary for the city's elite, a fortress of velvet drapery, gold leaf accents, and suffocating silence. Here, power was not spoken of. It was worn on the wrists and tasted in the vintage Bordeaux. Everett sat at the secluded corner table, a space perpetually reserved for him, radiating a quiet, terrifying authority. He was a man sculpted by the brutal inheritance of his family's underground empire. His suits were tailored in Milan, his demeanor forged in the unforgiving fires of the syndicate. Yet, tonight, the ruthless facade was fractured by the fragile woman sitting across from him. Rosa, his mother, stared blankly at the porcelain plate before her. Her silver hair was perfectly coiffed, her silk blouse immaculate, but the emptiness in her dark eyes was a chasm Everett's vast wealth could not fill. For months, the dementia had been a creeping fog, stealing the sharp, vivacious matriarch who had once ruled their family with an iron will and a warm laugh. Now, she was a ghost trapped in a gilded cage, murmuring to phantoms and refusing to eat. "Mother, please," Everett urged, his voice dropping to a gravelly, desperate whisper that he reserved only for her. "Just a bite of the risotto. It's made exactly how you used to like it." Rosa did not blink. Her trembling hands remained folded in her lap. The ambient hum of the restaurant, the clinking of sterling silver, the low murmur of power brokers seemed to agitate her. She began to rock slightly, her breath hitching in a way that made the two massive bodyguards flanking the alcove shift their weight in high alert. It was then that Isla approached the table. She did not move with the trembling reverence most staff exhibited when servicing Everett's table. Isla moved with a quiet, grounded grace. She wore the standard, crisp, white shirt and black apron of the establishment, her dark hair pulled back into a severe knot, framing a face that was striking not for its makeup, but for its intense, observant stillness. She carried a silver water pitcher, her eyes scanning the table, taking in the uneaten food, the rigid posture of the son, and the terrified isolation of the mother. As Isla reached to pour the water, Rosa suddenly gasped, her frail hand shooting out to grip the fabric of Isla's apron. One of the bodyguards immediately stepped forward, his hand slipping beneath his jacket. "Stand down," Everett snapped, his voice a whip crack that froze the guard in place. Everett watched, his muscles coiled tight, ready to intervene. He expected the waitress to pull away in panic. He expected her to call for a manager. Instead, Isla set the heavy silver pitcher down with agonizing, deliberate slowness. She did not look at Everett. She lowered herself until she was eye level with the trembling older woman. Rosa was murmuring, her voice a panicked, breathless string of broken English and standard Italian. "The water. The sea is too loud. They are coming. The salt is burning." Isla's expression softened. The rigid professional mask melted away, revealing a depth of sorrow and profound understanding that made Everett's breath hitch. Isla reached out, her pale, slender fingers gently covering Rosa's wrinkled, diamond-adorned hand. Then, she spoke. It was not the Italian Everett used with his associates. It was not the polished dialect taught in universities. It was the raw, lyrical, sun-baked dialect of Campania, specifically the obscure coastal village where Rosa had been born. It was a language of fishermen and olive groves, of ancient vendettas and fierce familial love. "Hush, little bird," Isla whispered in the dialect, her voice a soothing balm that seemed to alter the very air pressure around the table. "The sea is calm tonight. The salt is only from the tears, and the tears are washing away the dirt. You are safe. The storm has passed the cliffs." Rosa froze. The frantic rocking ceased. Her cloudy eyes widened, searching Isla's face as if looking at a ghost. For the first time in 6 months, clarity pierced the fog. Rosa lifted her other hand, trembling, and pressed it to Isla's cheek. "You know the cliffs?" Rosa whispered back in the same dialect, tears welling and spilling over her eyelashes. "I know the cliffs," Isla replied softly, a bittersweet smile touching her lips. "And I know the wind that blows through the lemon trees. Eat, mother. The journey is long." Rosa slowly turned her gaze to the risotto, picked up her silver fork, and took a bite. Everett sat completely paralyzed. The world around him had narrowed to a pinprick, focusing entirely on the young woman kneeling beside his mother. He had spent millions on specialists, neurologists, and private chefs, all to coax a single moment of peace from his mother's shattered mind. This stranger, a waitress in a sea of anonymous faces, had done it with a handful of whispered words. He stood up, the legs of his chair scraping sharply against the marble floor, cutting through the ambient noise of the room. Isla immediately withdrew her hand, rising to her feet, the professional mask slamming back into place. "Who are you?" Everett demanded, his voice a low, dangerous tremor that held the full, terrifying weight of his reputation. He wasn't asking for her name, he was asking for her soul. "Because you just stole my heart." Isla met his gaze. There was no fear in her eyes, only a quiet, resolute defiance that chilled him to the bone. "I am just your waitress, sir," she said, her English unaccented, cold and distant. "Enjoy your meal." Before he could stop her, she turned and vanished through the swinging kitchen doors, leaving Everett standing in the wreckage of his own shattered reality. The rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Everett's penthouse, smearing the neon lights of the city into bleeding streaks of red and gold. He stood in the darkness of his home office, a tumbler of amber liquid forgotten in his hand. The city below him was a sprawling grid of territories, rackets, and enemies he had spent the last decade conquering. He knew every politician's price, every rival's weakness, and every secret buried in the concrete foundations of the metropolis. But he did not know her. The encounter at the restaurant had gnawed at him for 3 days. It wasn't just the sheer audacity of her speaking to his mother, nor was it the miraculous effect it had on Rosa's condition. It was the dialect. That specific, hyper-regional cadence was nearly extinct. It was a language only spoken by a few hundred families who had fled the coast during the Mafia wars of the late 80s, wars that Everett's father had orchestrated. For a woman in her mid-20s to speak it with such native fluency meant she was connected to that blood-soaked history. The heavy oak doors of the office opened, and Julian, Everett's underboss and closest confidant, stepped into the gloom. Julian was a man carved from granite, devoid of sentimentality, operating purely on logic and violence. "You called for me," Julian said, his voice a low rumble. Everett didn't turn around. "The waitress from Laura. Did you get the file?" Julian approached the massive mahogany desk, dropping a manila folder onto the polished wood. The slap of the paper sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. "Isla. No last name on her employment forms, which is a violation of Laura's policy. But the manager said she paid him under the table to look the other way. She's a ghost, Ev. No digital footprint, no social media, no credit history before 5 years ago. It's like she walked out of the ocean and put on an apron." Everett finally turned, his jaw clenched. He moved to the desk and flicked open the folder. There was a single, grainy photograph of Isla walking out of the restaurant's back alley. Even in the poor lighting, the defiant tilt of her chin was evident. "Everyone leaves a footprint, Julian. If she doesn't have one, it means someone scrubbed it. And people who scrub their pasts are hiding from something. Or someone." Everett traced the edge of the photograph. "Where does she live?" "A studio apartment in the Narrows," Julian replied, referring to a dilapidated district on the edge of Everett's territory. "Rough area. We've got eyes on the building. She works double shifts, goes straight home, no friends, no visitors. She buys groceries from a corner bodega. That's it." "She spoke the dialect, Julian," Everett said softly, the danger creeping back into his tone. "My father's dialect. The one he tried to eradicate when he wiped out the coastal families." Julian's eyes narrowed. "You think she's a survivor? A revenge play? If she is, we need to end it tonight. You don't let a viper sleep in your bed." "She didn't come with a knife," Everett countered, staring intensely at the photograph. "She came with a lullaby. She calmed my mother. If she wanted to strike at me, She could have poisoned the water. She could have caused a scene. She did nothing but show kindness to a dying woman. Kindness from a ghost is a trap, Julian warned, turning toward the door. Give the word, and she disappears. Permanently. No. The word was absolute, ringing with finality. No one touches her. Pull the watchers back. I will handle this myself. Across the city, in a damp, freezing apartment in the Narrows, Isla sat on a thrift store mattress, her knees pulled to her chest. The rain battered her single, cracked window. The radiator hissed weakly, offering no real warmth. The apartment was stripped bare of personality, holding only the absolute essentials for survival. Isla reached under her mattress and pulled out a small velvet pouch. Her hands, rough from hot water and carrying trays, trembled slightly as she opened it. Inside was a heavy silver pocket watch, dented and scorched. Inside the lid was an engraved inscription in the coastal dialect. For my brother in blood, until the sea takes us. It was a watch that had belonged to Everett's father, gifted to Isla's father before the great betrayal. Before Everett's family grew rich and powerful, and Isla's family was slaughtered, forcing her mother to flee into the shadows with a newborn. Isla closed her eyes, fighting the rising tide of panic. She had spent 5 years meticulously building a life of invisibility, working adjacent to Everett's empire just to keep an eye on the monster who had inherited her family's ruin. She had promised herself she would never engage, never draw attention. She was just a watcher, making sure the danger never looked her way. But when she saw Rosa, the woman who had secretly smuggled Isla's mother to safety the night of the massacre, trembling and broken, the strict rules of survival had shattered. She couldn't let the old woman suffer. Now, the monster had seen her. He had looked at her with eyes that missed nothing. You just stole my heart, he had said. The phrase echoed in her mind, terrifying and magnetic. She knew what Everett was capable of. He was a predator, and by speaking, she had just painted a target on her own back. She clutched the silver watch to her chest, the cold metal biting into her skin. Tomorrow, she would have to run again. The diner at the edge of the Narrows smelled of stale grease, burnt coffee, and desperation. It was a stark contrast to the opulence of Laura. Here, the linoleum was peeling, and the patrons were weary laborers nursing hangovers or dodging the morning rain. Isla worked her morning shifts here to make rent, preferring the chaotic anonymity of the breakfast rush to the suffocating scrutiny of high society dinners. She was wiping down the counter, her mind racing with plans to pack her meager belongings, when the diner's bell chimed. The ambient chatter of the room died instantly. Isla didn't have to look up to know who had entered. The shift in the atmosphere was palpable. The air grew heavy, thick with the sudden, unspoken fear of the patrons. She slowly raised her eyes from the damp rag in her hands. Everett stood in the doorway. He was out of place. An apex predator wandering into a cage of mice. He wore a tailored charcoal overcoat, rain beating on the dark wool, his presence commanding absolute submission. 2 of his men stood outside in the downpour, flanking a sleek black town car. But Everett had entered alone. He didn't look at the terrified patrons who were quickly averting their eyes and abandoning their meals. His gaze was locked on Isla, piercing and unyielding. He walked to the counter, taking a seat on a cracked vinyl stool directly across from her. "Coffee," he said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the cheap Formica counter. Black. Isla's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs, but her face remained a mask of stone. She turned, grabbed the glass pot from the burner, and poured the dark liquid into a chipped ceramic mug. She set it down in front of him without spilling a drop. $2, she said, her voice steady. Everett didn't reach for his wallet. He picked up the mug, ignoring the scalding heat, and took a slow sip, his eyes never leaving hers. "You weren't at Laura last night. I was feeling unwell," Isla lied smoothly, picking up her rag and aggressively wiping a spot on the counter that was already clean. "I called in. You were packing your bags," Everett corrected quietly. Isla's hand froze. She looked up, meeting his terrifying gaze. The air between them crackled, fraught with an intense, magnetic tension. He was close enough that she could smell the rain on his coat, the expensive bergamot of his cologne, and the faint, metallic scent of danger that always clung to him. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, pulling her hand back. I know you don't have a last name, Everett continued, leaning forward slightly. His voice dropping to a register meant only for her. I know you pay cash for a rotting apartment 3 blocks from here. I know you don't exist on paper before 5 years ago. And I know that yesterday, you pulled my mother out of a darkness no doctor has been able to penetrate in a year. Isla swallowed hard. I was just doing my job. Your job is to pour water. Not to speak the dead language of a coastal village that was wiped off the map 20 years ago. Everett's eyes darkened, searching her face, cataloging every micro-expression. Who are you, Isla? Who sent you? Nobody sent me, she flared, a sudden spark of genuine anger breaking through her carefully constructed facade. She leaned over the counter, closing the distance between them, driven by a sudden, reckless courage. Not everything in the world is about your empire, Everett. Not everyone is a piece on your chessboard. Your mother was terrified. I spoke to her because she is a human being who was suffering while her son sat there acting like she was an inconvenience. The diner was dead silent. The few remaining patrons held their breath, waiting for the Mafia boss to drag the audacious waitress out by her hair. Everett didn't move. He stared at her, genuinely shocked. In his world, people did not speak to him this way. They cowered. They flattered. They bled. But this woman with calloused hands and fierce, dark eyes was challenging him, completely unafraid of his crown. A strange, unfamiliar emotion twisted violently in his chest. It wasn't anger. It was awe. She wasn't an inconvenience, Everett said, his voice surprisingly soft, stripping away the intimidation. The raw vulnerability in his tone caught Isla off guard. She is the only piece of my soul I have left, and I am failing her. Isla watched the ruthless facade crack for a fraction of a second, revealing the exhausted, desperate son beneath. The monster she had been taught to fear suddenly looked entirely human. The dialect. Everett pressed, his eyes pleading now. Where did you learn it? Isla stepped back, rebuilding her walls. My grandmother. She was from the coast. She taught me before she died. It's just a coincidence. I don't believe in coincidences, Everett said. He reached into his coat and pulled out a thick stack of crisp $100 bills, laying them on the counter. My mother has not eaten since you left. She cries out for the girl from the cliffs. She is starving herself. Isla stared at the money, a sick feeling rising in her stomach. I can't be bought. It's not a purchase. It's a plea. Everett stood up, towering over her. The vulnerability vanished, replaced by a desperate, ironclad resolve. I am sending a car to your apartment at 6 o'clock tonight. You will come to my estate. You will have dinner with my mother. You will speak to her. You will name your price, and I will pay it. And if I refuse? Isla asked, her chin jutting out defiantly. Everett stepped closer, leaning over the counter until his lips were inches from her ear. Then I will have to start asking the questions you are running so desperately to avoid answering. He pulled back, held her gaze for one agonizingly long second, and then turned and walked out of the diner, the bell chiming a cheerful, mocking sound as the heavy door slammed shut behind him. Isla stood frozen, staring at the small fortune on the counter, knowing that her invisibility was entirely, irreversibly destroyed. The black town car idling outside Isla's apartment building looked like a shark navigating a shallow, muddy pond. The rain had intensified, turning the potholed street into a dark, rushing river. Neighbors peeked through dirty blinds. Watching the intimidating vehicle and the stoic, broad-shouldered driver waiting by the open rear door, Isla stood on the cracked linoleum of her hallway, her small duffel bag slung over her shoulder. She had packed her essentials. She could slip out the fire escape, navigate the alleys, and be on a bus out of the state before Everett realized she was gone. She had the cash from the diner counter. It was enough to start over, again, but as she placed her hand on the cold iron of the fire escape window, a memory assaulted her. She saw Rosa's trembling hands, the desperate, hollow look in her eyes, and the miraculous, fleeting moment of peace the old dialect had brought her. Isla knew about the darkness of the mind. She had watched her own mother succumb to paranoia and grief, fading away in a cold room while Isla stood by, helpless. Could she really abandon Rosa to that same torturous decline? Even if she was the mother of the devil himself? Isla cursed under her breath, a harsh, jagged sound. She dropped the duffel bag, turned, and walked down the stairs to the front door. The driver didn't speak as she approached. He merely held an umbrella over her and gestured to the plush leather interior. Isla slid in, the heavy door closing with a solid, suffocating thud that sealed her inside Everett's world. The drive was a silent journey from purgatory to Olympus. They left the grimy, neon-lit streets of the Narrows, winding upward into the exclusive, heavily guarded hills overlooking the city. The gates of Everett's estate were wrought iron monstrosities, swinging open to reveal a sprawling stone mansion that looked less like a home and more like a fortress. Isla stepped out of the car into the biting cold. The architecture was imposing, all sharp angles and dark stone, designed to intimidate. She was led through massive mahogany doors into a grand foyer paved with marble that echoed every footstep. The wealth was staggering, but the air inside was sterile, devoid of warmth or life. It felt like a mausoleum. Everett was waiting for her at the top of the grand staircase. He had shed the overcoat and jacket, wearing only a black dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up, revealing heavily tattooed forearms that hinted at the violence of his past. He looked exhausted, the shadows under his eyes deeper than before. He descended the stairs, stopping a few steps above her, forcing her to look up at him. "You didn't run. I thought about it," Isla replied honestly, refusing to shrink under his gaze. "Where is she?" Everett's jaw tightened. "In the conservatory. She's had a bad day. She thinks the men are coming for the house again." The vulnerability in his voice was disarming. Isla nodded briefly and bypassed him, following the distant sound of agitated weeping down a long, dimly lit corridor. Everett followed closely behind, his presence a heavy, oppressive shadow. The conservatory was a massive glass dome filled with exotic, overgrown plants. It smelled of damp earth and orchids. In the center, sitting in a velvet armchair, was Rosa. She was weeping hysterically, her hands covering her face, rocking back and forth. "The fire!" Rosa cried out, her voice raw. "The smoke is in the house. Where is the boy? Hide the boy." Everett moved forward, his face etched with agony, but Isla put a hand on his chest, stopping him. Her touch was brief, but it sent a shockwave through him. He looked down at her hand, then at her face. "Let me," she whispered. Isla stepped forward, bypassing the clinical, sterile approach Everett usually took. She didn't try to reason with the hallucination. She stepped into it. She knelt on the cold stone floor beside the chair and began to hum. It was a low, mournful melody, a traditional fisherman's dirge from the coastal villages, used to mourn those lost at sea, but also used as a lullaby to promise children that the sea would eventually calm. Rosa's rocking slowed. The crying hitched and then stopped. She slowly lowered her hands, her tear-streaked face turning toward the sound. "The wind," Rosa murmured in the dialect. "The wind has changed, Mother," Isla replied in the same ancient tongue, her voice steady and resonant. "The fire is out. The ash is washing away in the rain. We are safe in the stone." Rosa let out a long, shuddering sigh, the tension draining from her frail body. She reached out, her fingers finding Isla's dark hair, stroking it gently. "You have the eyes of the sea," Rosa whispered, "just like the man who ran." Isla's breath caught in her throat. Her heart hammered violently against her ribs. The man who ran. That was the syndicate's mocking title for her father, the man who had supposedly fled with the family's money, though Isla knew he had actually been murdered by Everett's father to cover up his own theft. Everett, standing near the doorway, tensed. He had caught the phrase. His fluency in the dialect was rusty, but he understood enough. He watched the micro-expression of pure, unadulterated panic flash across Isla's face. He saw the way her shoulders went rigid, the way she forced herself to swallow before smiling back at his mother. "Rest now," Isla said to Rosa, ignoring the pounding of her own heart. "The tide is low." Rosa closed her eyes, a peaceful, youthful expression settling over her weathered features. Within minutes, the exhaustion of the panic attack pulled her into a deep sleep. Isla gently extracted herself from Rosa's grip and stood up. She turned to find Everett blocking the only exit, his body rigid, his eyes dark and stormy. He had seen the reaction. He had heard the words. "Dinner is served," Everett said, his voice stripped of the vulnerability from earlier. It was the voice of the boss again. Cold. Absolute. "We have a lot to talk about, Isla." The dining room was a cavernous space. dominated by a table long enough to seat a warring council. Everett sat at the head. Isla was placed immediately to his right. The spatial intimacy felt intentional, a trap designed to keep her within striking distance. The meal, exquisite cuts of meat and roasted vegetables, sat practically untouched between them. The silence was heavy, oppressive, broken only by the ticking of an antique grandfather clock and the muffled roar of the rain against the estate's thick windows. Everett swirled the dark wine in his crystal glass, his eyes fixed on Isla. She sat rigidly, her posture perfect, refusing to show the terror clawing at her insides. She was in the belly of the beast. The man sitting beside her had inherited the empire built on her family's graveyard. "The man who ran?" Everett said suddenly, his voice echoing in the quiet room. He didn't ask a question. He simply laid the phrase on the table like a loaded gun. Isla kept her gaze on her plate. Dementia is a cruel disease. The mind creates stories to fill the gaps. My mother's mind is shattered, yes, Everett agreed softly, leaning closer. But the fragments left behind are memories, not inventions. She spoke of the coastal fire of '98, the night my father consolidated power, the night his partner, Antonio, supposedly betrayed him and fled with the cartel money. Isla's grip on her napkin tightened until her knuckles turned white. Hearing her father's name in the mouth of his murderer's son sent a spike of pure, blinding rage through her veins. She fought it down, burying it under years of practiced apathy. "I don't know local history," Isla said, taking a slow sip of water to wet her dry throat. "I'm just a waitress." "You stopped being just a waitress the moment you walked into my mother's hallucination and knew exactly how to navigate it," Everett countered. He reached out, his large, warm hand covering hers on the table. The contact was electric, a shocking contrast to the coldness of his interrogation. "You are trembling, Isla." She yanked her hand back as if he had burned her. "I'm cold. You're terrified." Everett's gaze softened infinitesimally. "Why?" "I brought you here to help my mother, and you have. I owe you a debt. In my world, debts are sacred, yet you sit here looking at me as if I'm about to order your execution. Aren't you?" The words slipped out before Isla could stop them, bitter and sharp. Everett reeled back slightly, genuinely taken aback. He studied her face, the fierce, defensive set of her jaw, the dark eyes wide with an old, deep-seated trauma. For a moment, he wasn't looking at a mysterious woman. He was looking at a mirror of his own guarded soul. He had spent his entire life waiting for the knife in the dark, trusting no one, living in the shadow of a father whose legacy was bathed in blood. "I have killed men," Everett said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. He wasn't boasting. It was a confession, heavy with exhaustion. "I have dismantled families to protect my own. I wear a crown forged in misery. But I do not harm innocents, and I would cut out my own heart before I hurt the woman who brought peace to my mother." Isla stared at him, the sincerity in his voice warring with everything she knew about his bloodline. "Your father didn't share that philosophy." The temperature in the room plummeted. Everett's posture went rigid. "What do you know about my father?" "I know that empires like yours aren't built on handshakes." Isla shot back, the anger finally overwhelming the fear. "I know that when men like your father want power, they burn down anything and anyone in their way. And they don't care who is left in the ashes." She stood up abruptly, throwing her napkin onto the table. "I have helped your mother. Let me leave." Everett stood up slowly. He didn't move to stop her physically, but his presence filled the room, making the air too thick to breathe. "You know something. You know who the man who ran is. You know the dialect. You know exactly what happened in the coastal fire." "Let me leave, Everett," she demanded, her voice cracking. Before Everett could respond, the heavy dining room doors swung open. Julian stood in the threshold, his face a mask of grim satisfaction. He held a thin, red folder in his hand. "I'm sorry to interrupt, boss," Julian said, though he didn't look sorry at all. His cold eyes shifted from Everett to Isla, pinning her to the wall like a butterfly on a corkboard. "But we found the scrub. The ghost has a name." Isla's blood ran cold. The floor seemed to drop out from beneath her. Everett looked at Julian, then slowly turned his gaze back to Isla. The vulnerability, the fragile connection they had just shared, vanished entirely, replaced by the terrifying, unreadable mask of the syndicate boss. "Bring it to the library, Julian," Everett ordered, never taking his eyes off Isla, "and lock down the estate." No one leaves. The library was a sprawling room of dark mahogany and floor-to-ceiling bookshelves that smelled of old leather and expensive cigars. The thunder outside cracked like artillery fire, illuminating the room in brief, violent flashes of white light. Everett stood behind a massive desk, the red folder open before him. Isla stood in the center of the room, surrounded by shadows. The heavy oak doors were locked behind her. There was no escape. Everett read the contents of the folder in agonizing silence. With every second that ticked by, Isla felt the noose tightening around her neck. She braced herself for the anger, for the violence. She prepared to meet her end with the dignity her father had been denied. Finally, Everett closed the folder. He didn't look angry. He looked devastated. Isla Rossi, he said. The name tasted heavy in the air. Isla didn't flinch. She lifted her chin, accepting her true name for the first time in over a decade. Yes, Everett leaned his hands heavily on the desk, his head bowed. Your father was Antonio Rossi, my father's right hand, the man who supposedly stole $3 million from the cartel alliance and fled to South America, leaving my father to face the cartel's wrath. That's the lie your father told the council, Isla said, her voice ringing clear and steady in the dark room. That's the lie that bought him total control of the syndicate. He needed a scapegoat to cover his own theft. He needed the cartel to hunt a ghost while he built his empire. Everett looked up, his eyes bloodshot. The coastal fire. The Rossi compound. My father didn't run, Isla said, her voice trembling now with the weight of a 15-year-old grief. Your father called him to the compound for a meeting. He brought his soldiers. They shot my father in the chest and set the house on fire to make it look like cartel retaliation. Everett stepped out from behind the desk, moving slowly toward her. How did you survive? Your mother, Isla whispered, tears finally breaking free, sliding down her pale cheeks. Everett stopped dead in his tracks. What? My mother and I were in the guest house, Isla explained, the memories rushing back with sickening clarity. Your mother had come to the compound that night to bring a gift for my birthday. She saw your father's men surrounding the main house. She knew what was happening. While your father was murdering my father, your mother ran to the guest house. She grabbed my mother and me, shoved us into the trunk of her own car, and drove us through the police barricades. She gave my mother all the cash she had in her purse and told us to run and never look back. Everett staggered back as if he had been physically struck. He gripped the edge of a leather armchair to steady himself. The entire foundation of his reality, his father's legacy. The justification for his family's brutal rise to power. The empire he bled every day to protect was built on a monumental, treacherous lie. My mother saved you, he breathed, the realization crashing over him. She defied my father. And the guilt broke her mind, Isla said softly, the anger draining out of her, leaving only profound sadness. She couldn't live with the monster she was married to. She couldn't save my father, but she saved us. That's why she recognizes me. I look like my mother. I speak the dialect because we had to hide in the deep country for years before my mother died of a broken heart. Everett stared at her, seeing her not as an intruder, not as a threat, but as the living embodiment of his family's greatest sin. He had built his life on a throne of bone, believing it was righteous strength. Now, he saw the blood dripping from his own hands. Why did you come back? Everett asked, his voice cracking. If you survived, why come back to the city I control? Why work at the restaurant I own? Were you planning to kill me? I wanted to, Isla confessed, her eyes burning into his. For years I planned it. I learned your routines. I got the job at Laura just to get close to you. I wanted to look into the eyes of the devil's son before I burned his empire down. Everett stood perfectly still, accepting the judgment. Why didn't you? Because I saw you with her, Isla whispered, her voice breaking. I watched you at that table for months. I saw the ruthless monster the city fears, gently cutting his mother's food. I heard the way you spoke to her. I saw your desperation to save her. She shook her head, tears falling freely. You aren't your father, Everett. You're just a man trapped in the cage he built, and I couldn't punish your mother by taking her son away from her. The silence in the library was absolute, save for the rain. Everett crossed the space between them in 2 long strides. He didn't grab her. He didn't threaten her. He fell to his knees on the Persian rug in front of her. The ruthless Mafia boss, the man who commanded armies and ruled the city's shadows, bowed his head until his forehead rested against her trembling hands. "I am sorry," Everett choked out, a raw, guttural sob tearing its way out of his throat. It was an apology for his father, for the years of terror, for the stolen lives. "I am so damn sorry, Isla." Isla looked down at the broken man at her feet. She had spent her entire life hating the name he bore, but looking at him now, she felt the heavy, suffocating chain of vengeance shatter. She slowly lowered herself to the floor, kneeling in front of him, and gently rested her forehead against his. In the darkness of the library, the debts of the past were finally laid bare, binding the two survivors of a forgotten war together in the ashes. The fragile sanctuary of the library was abruptly shattered. The heavy oak doors burst open with a violent crack, rebounding off the walls. Everett and Isla sprang apart, scrambling to their feet. Julian stood in the doorway, a silenced pistol gripped loosely in his right hand. His face was a mask of cold, predatory calculation. Behind him, two of Everett's most loyal enforcers stood guard in the hallway, blocking any exit. "I heard enough through the door, boss," Julian said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. He stepped into the room, raising the gun slightly. "She's Rossi's kid, a loose end from the old days, and a threat to everything we've built." Everett stepped instantly in front of Isla, shielding her completely with his body. The vulnerability from moments ago vanished, instantly replaced by the terrifying, apex predator presence that had made him the king of the city. "Put the gun down, Julian," Everett commanded. His voice was not a shout. It was a deadly, quiet promise of absolute destruction. Julian didn't lower the weapon. He aimed it squarely at Everett's chest, though his eyes remained locked on the space behind him where Isla stood. "You're compromised, Ev. You're letting sentimentality cloud your judgment. If the council finds out that the Rossi girl is alive, that your father lied about the cartel money to seize power, the other families will use it to tear us apart. It's a weakness. In our world, weakness is death. The lie is the weakness." Everett roared, the facade finally cracking into pure fury. "We've been bleeding for a decade to protect an empire built on the murder of a loyal man. My father was a butcher. I will not let his sins demand another sacrifice." "It's not about your father anymore. It's about survival," Julian countered, his finger tightening marginally on the trigger. "Step aside, Everett. Let me clean up the mess. You'll thank me tomorrow." Isla gripped the back of Everett's shirt, her knuckles white. She was terrified, but she refused to cower. "He'll kill you too, Everett," she whispered fiercely. "He wants the crown." Julian smirked, a cold, humorless twisting of his lips. "She's smart. The girl is smart. If you fall, boss, someone has to keep the family strong. The council would support a transition of power if they knew you were betraying your own bloodline for a waitress." Everett calculated the distance. 10 feet. Julian was a marksman. If Everett rushed him, he might take the bullet. But Julian would still have a clear shot at Isla before Everett could reach him. The enforcers in the hall were loyal to the chair, not the man. If Julian killed Everett and claimed he was compromised, they would fall in line. "You want the crown, Julian?" Everett asked, his voice suddenly calm, dropping the volume to force the usurper to listen closer. "You think you can wear it? It's heavy. It rots you from the inside out." Everett slowly raised his hands, a gesture of surrender. But his eyes were locked onto Julian's, projecting a hypnotic, paralyzing intensity. "Don't do this, Everett," Isla begged, her voice cracking. "I'm giving you the empire, Julian," Everett said softly, taking one slow step to the side, exposing Isla, but keeping his own body coiled like a spring. "But she walks out of here. Safe, untouched. You get the syndicates, the territory, the wealth. You let her go, and I walk away. The throne is yours." Julian's eyes flickered. Greed warred with protocol in his calculating mind. Total control of the city without a bloody civil war. It was everything he had secretly coveted for years. He lowered the gun by a fraction of an inch, his mind processing the surrender. That fraction of an inch was all Everett needed. With explosive speed, Everett lunged not at Julian, but at the heavy brass lamp on the desk. In one fluid motion, he swept his arm, sending the heavy lamp flying directly at Julian's head, while simultaneously sweeping the red folder off the desk. Julian ducked instinctively, raising his arms. The lamp smashed into the doorframe, showering glass and brass into the hallway. The sudden chaos distracted the enforcers outside for a vital second. Everett closed the distance before Julian could recover his aim. He slammed into his underboss, driving a knee into Julian's stomach and grabbing the wrist holding the gun. The two men crashed heavily into the bookshelves, splintering wood and sending leather-bound books cascading around them. "Run, Isla!" Everett roared, grappling with the younger, stronger man. Julian twisted violently, trying to bring the muzzle of the gun toward Everett's side. Isla didn't run to the door. She saw the heavy crystal inkwell on the desk. She snatched it, ran forward, and brought it down with all her strength onto the back of Julian's hand. A sickening crack echoed in the room. Julian screamed, his fingers spasming open, dropping the gun. Everett immediately spun, delivering a brutal, decisive blow to Julian's jaw. The underboss's eyes rolled back, and he collapsed to the floor, unconscious. The two enforcers burst into the room, their weapons drawn, assessing the chaos. They saw Julian bleeding on the floor, and their boss standing over him, chest heaving, his eyes burning with a demonic fury. Everett picked up Julian's dropped gun and aimed it at the enforcers. "Julian is a traitor," Everett barked, his voice carrying the full, terrifying authority of the throne he was supposedly ready to abandon. He drew a weapon on his boss. "You know the penalty. Stand down, or die with him." The enforcers looked at each other, then at Julian on the floor. Slowly, deliberately, they lowered their weapons and stepped back into the hall. Everett dropped the gun onto the desk. He turned to Isla. She was trembling violently, staring at the unconscious man on the floor. Everett walked to her, wrapping his arms around her, pulling her against his chest. She collapsed into his embrace, burying her face in his shoulder, the adrenaline finally crashing. "You're safe," Everett whispered into her hair, kissing the top of her head, his own heart hammering a frantic rhythm against hers. "I've got you. It's over." The dawn broke over the city in streaks of bruised purple and gold, burning away the remnants of the night's storm. The estate was eerily quiet. Julian and the loyalists had been removed, locked away in the estate's holding cells to await the council's judgment. The immediate threat was neutralized. But the war was far from over. Everett sat on the stone balcony extending from the master suite, staring out at the sprawling metropolis below. The city was a grid of his sins, every skyscraper a monument to his family's ruthless ambition. For 10 years, he had believed it was his duty to maintain it. Now, it felt like a prison. Isla stepped onto the balcony. She wore one of Everett's oversized cashmere sweaters, her hair damp from a shower. She carried 2 mugs of steaming coffee, handing one to him. The warmth of the mug grounded him. "Are you going to kill him?" Isla asked softly, looking out over the city. "Julian?" Everett took a sip of the bitter coffee. "In the old days, I would have had him dismantled in front of the council to make a point. But no, I'm giving him exactly what I offered him in the library." Isla turned to him in shock. "You're giving him the Empire?" "I'm stepping down," Everett said, turning to look at her. The dark circles under his eyes remained, but the heavy, oppressive weight that usually settled on his shoulders was gone. "The council will vote. Julian is ambitious. They will back him. Let him have the headaches, the blood, and the paranoia. I am liquidating my legitimate assets, transferring my mother's care to a private, secure facility overseas, and walking away." "You can't just walk away from the Mafia, Everett," Isla said, her voice laced with fear. "They'll hunt you." "They will hunt the boss," Everett corrected, a faint, genuine smile touching his lips. "But the boss is dead. I am leaving Julian the entire infrastructure intact. In exchange, he signs a pact of non-aggression. He gets the throne, and I get my life. It's a trade he won't refuse." Isla searched his face, looking for the lie, looking for the trap. She only saw absolute, terrifying sincerity. "You're giving up everything, all this power. Because of me?" Everett set his coffee mug down on the stone balustrade. He took a step closer to her, invading her space gently, respectfully. He reached out, his thumb gently tracing the line of her jaw, marveling at the strength and resilience etched into her features. "I am giving up a cage, Isla," he whispered, his eyes dropping to her lips before meeting her gaze again. "I have been dead for 10 years. You walked into that restaurant. You spoke a language I thought was lost to the ashes, and you woke me up. You showed me that I don't have to be my father's monster." Isla's breath hitched. The fear that had defined her life for 15 years was dissolving, replaced by a terrifying, exhilarating hope. She leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering shut for a moment. "My father died to protect your mother," Isla said quietly. "He believed in loyalty over greed, and I will spend the rest of my life honoring his sacrifice," Everett promised, his voice thick with emotion. He leaned his forehead against hers, closing the distance between them. "Come with me, Isla. Let me show you a world where you don't have to run anymore. A world where the sea is calm." Isla opened her eyes. She looked at the man who was supposed to be her greatest enemy, the man who had laid his empire at her feet to atone for sins he didn't commit. She saw the bruised, battered soul beneath the tailored suits and the terrifying reputation. She saw a man she could love. "I want to see the cliffs," Isla whispered, a tear slipping down her cheek, catching the golden light of the dawn. "I want to see the lemon trees." Everett smiled, a bright, breathtaking expression that wiped 10 years of cruelty off his face. He wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her tight against his chest, lifting her slightly off the ground. "Then we are going to the cliffs." Later that afternoon, the transition began. Everett's lawyers drafted the documents, moving mountains of wealth into untraceable offshore accounts, securing his mother's future, and legally severing his ties to the syndicate. Julian, nursing a broken hand and a shattered jaw, signed the treaties in a tense, silent meeting, officially claiming the crown. As Everett walked out of the boardroom for the last time, leaving the darkness behind, he felt lighter than he had in a decade. He walked to the waiting car where Isla sat in the back seat, holding Rosa's hand. Rosa looked at Everett as he got in. Her eyes were still cloudy, but she smiled. A genuine, peaceful expression. "The storm has passed, my son," she murmured. "Yes, mother," Everett said, looking across the seat at Isla, whose dark eyes were shining with a brilliant, undeniable light. "The storm is finally over." The Mediterranean sun was mercilessly bright, turning the Tyrrhenian Sea into a blinding expanse of crushed diamonds. High on the cliffs of the Amalfi coast, a small, whitewashed villa clung to the rock face, surrounded by terraced gardens of ancient lemon trees and vibrant climbing bougainvillea. It had been 6 months since they left the city. 6 months since Everett traded his empire for exile. The transition hadn't been easy. The paranoia took months to fade. Everett still found himself waking in the middle of the night, his muscles coiled, expecting an assassin in the shadows. Isla had spent weeks jumping at the sound of a car engine on the winding coastal road, but here, bathed in the salt air and the blinding sun, the ghosts of the past were slowly losing their grip. Everett stood on the stone terrace, wearing a simple linen shirt and trousers, his bare feet warm against the terracotta tiles. He was using a small pruning shear to trim a massive lemon tree, his hands stained with citrus and dirt. He looked younger, the harsh lines around his mouth softened by the constant presence of peace. Inside the villa, the sound of laughter drifted through the open French doors. It was a sound Everett still found miraculous. He set down the shears and walked toward the house, leaning against the doorframe. In the sun-drenched kitchen, Isla was standing at a heavy wooden table, her hands covered in flour. She was wearing a simple sundress, her hair tied back with a bright scarf. Beside her sat Rosa. Rosa's dementia had not been cured. It was a thief that never fully returned what it stole, but the environment had worked a magic no doctor could explain. Surrounded by the sights, sounds, and smells of her childhood, Rosa's panic attacks had vanished. She was calm, often lucid for hours at a time, finding joy in simple, tactile tasks. Isla was guiding Rosa's hands, teaching her how to knead the pasta dough. They were speaking rapidly in the old coastal dialect, a musical, rhythmic conversation punctuated by Isla's bright laughter. "You push with the heel of the hand, Nana," Isla instructed gently, using the affectionate term for grandmother, like the waves pushing against the rocks. "I remember the waves," Rosa murmured, a soft smile on her face. She looked up and caught Everett watching them from the doorway. "Your father is being lazy. Make him fetch the tomatoes." Everett chuckled, walking into the kitchen. He wrapped his arms around Isla from behind, burying his face in the crook of her neck, inhaling the scent of vanilla, flour, and the ocean. He pressed a kiss behind her ear, making her shiver and laugh, swatting at him with a floury hand. "I am not lazy," Everett defended himself to his mother, though he didn't let go of Isla. I am cultivating the garden, providing for my family. You are distracting the cook, Isla teased, turning her head to kiss his cheek. Leaving a smudge of white flour on his skin, Everett looked at the two women. The mother he had spent a fortune trying to save, and the woman who had saved them both with a handful of whispered words. He thought of the cold, sprawling penthouse he had left behind, the millions in the bank, the terrifying power he had wielded. He didn't miss a single second of it. The blood debt had been paid. The cycle of violence his father started had been broken. Here, on the edge of the world, Everett had finally found his soul. Later that evening, after Rosa had been put to bed with a gentle lullaby, Everett and Isla sat on the terrace, a bottle of local red wine open between them. The sun was dipping below the horizon, setting the sky ablaze in violent hues of crimson and gold before bleeding into the deep, bruised purple of twilight. Isla rested her head on Everett's shoulder. He wrapped a heavy wool blanket around them both, pulling her closer against the evening chill. "Do you ever regret it?" Isla asked quietly, looking at the distant lights of fishing boats bobbing on the black water. Giving it all up? Everett turned his head, pressing his lips to her forehead. He thought of the moment in the restaurant, the precise second his world tilted on its axis, when a brave, defiant waitress had spoken a dead language to a dying woman. "I didn't give anything up," Everett whispered into the cool night air, his arm tightening around the woman who had brought him back to life. "You just stole my heart, and I am entirely grateful you did." The quiet strength of forgiveness holds a power far greater than the loudest acts of vengeance. Everett and Isla's journey reminds us that our pasts may shape the foundations of our lives, but we alone choose what we build upon them. True power isn't found in ruling with fear, but in having the courage to break toxic cycles and choose love over legacy. If this story of redemption, hidden truths, and transformative love resonated with you, please consider hitting the like button, sharing it with someone who appreciates a deep, cinematic narrative, and subscribing for more intense, emotionally driven stories. Your support helps bring more of these worlds to life.